This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
I could listen to you all afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for staying. I've spent the last 48 hours wishing that I'd written Zeppelin Nights after this conference rather than before, because if we need any reminding that this is an extraordinary history packed into just these 4.25 years, this conference has done it. What an extraordinarily rich history this city has in those 4.25 years. And it's confirmed me in a view that I've held, I must say, for some years now, that London, the First World War was a key turning point in the history of London in the 20th century. And I'll try to elucidate why that is in the course of this lecture about legacy. The end of the war was, of course, a moment of great joy, especially in London, and a moment of much sorrow too for many who had lost loved ones. But it was also a moment of considerable apprehension. For some, the approaching end of the war was itself an alarming prospect. Like the waitress in Mary Ward's Harvest, a novel set in London in 1918, who earns 7 or 8 shillings a day in late 1918, and now the war's going to stop, she says. Do you think I want it to stop? I don't think. Me and my sister will be starving again. This fear of the future shaded the armistice. No citizen knows what is going to happen to himself or his children or to his own social circle or to the state or the empire, thought Beatrice Webb in Grosvenor Road, Westminster, a week before the final maroons of the war sounded. And although Armistice Day pushed these feelings to the back of most minds, they undoubtedly revived in the run-up to 1919. What sort of London would the 7 million Londoners face as a new post-war era began to assert itself? London had been greatly changed by the war, but would those changes last? Some changes were the stuff of tragedy, and their consequences lingered for a generation. This was a post-war city that had to live with the dreadful consequences of the war in men killed and wounded, the enduring pain of bereavement, and the legacy of remembrance, symbolized so powerfully in the capital through Edwin Lutyens' monumental cenotaph, unveiled in its first wooden state on 11 November 1920, and the tomb of the unknown warrior, the body interred in Westminster Abbey that same day. London would be, and still remains, the capital of remembrance in the United Kingdom, and to a certain extent, I think, the Commonwealth too. And we had a very powerful paper yesterday from John Siblon on aspects of that tradition. Just how many London men died in the First World War is unknown, but something around 90 to 100,000 men seems likely, with around 230,000 more wounded. These, together with casualties from the air raids, were the direct costs in flesh and blood of the First World War in London. Then many things had to be undone to restore the city to something approaching normal life. Demobilization of 2.6 million men from the army at the rate of some 10,000 and more a day nationwide proceeded through the first 6 months of 1919. Demobilisation for the London district began at Wimbledon Common, but moved to Crystal Palace in January 1919 as it offered better comforts for the men waiting to be processed. Many of London's employers, like Sainsbury's and the London General Omnibus Company, honoured as best they could their promise to take men back who had volunteered for service. They did so largely at the expense of women workers. Over the same period, 90% of the nation's women munition workers were discharged from their employment, many unwillingly. And many government offices largely staffed by women during the war closed altogether or replaced their staffs with ex-servicemen. This was not effected without protest, with deputations of workers to Whitehall and some protest marches of men and women workers alike in early 1919. For men and women returning to the labour market, employment in London remained buoyant until a slump in engineering brought something approaching large-scale worklessness back to the capital, as to many other industrial areas of the country, from February to August 1921. Yet even when things got back to normal, with the dislocation of women workers and the return of periodic boom and bust, everything had changed. When, at the end of the 1920s, social scientists at the London School of Economics came to update Charles Booth's poverty investigations of 40 years before, they found that, I quote, "Across every path of gradual progress, the Great War of 1914-18 cut a deep gash, which is not yet closed up. The reader of the present volume will again and again be confronted with the fact that the most fruitful comparison is not so much between now and 40 years ago as between post-war and pre-war conditions. So much greater and more striking have sometimes been the sudden changes wrought in the conditions of London life and labour by the great catastrophe than by the slighter and more gradual movements of the whole of the preceding generation." They continued, "We are living too near the events of the war," this was written in 1930, "and of the years immediately following it to be able to see the changes as a whole and in due perspective. We can, however, already see enough to be sure that there can be no mere reversion to pre-war conditions, but that a new chapter has opened in our social and economic history, of which as yet it's difficult to forecast the contents." That was written, as I say, about London, probably to a very large extent, though not entirely. What was true for London was true for the nation as a whole. But it was frequently the case that what the nation experienced, London felt more sharply and to a greater degree than the rest of the country. Take, for instance, the return to domestic service of women from one kind or another of war work. The war put paid to the vast, inexhaustible market for women domestic servants that had prevailed in pre-war London. There were two main breaks with the past. First, the supply of domestic servants evaporated with astonishing speed from 1915 as women filled the ranks of munitions workers and every kind of industrial employment. And second, in response, the middle-class housing market shifted rapidly from the West End townhouse or mansion on 4 or 5 floors to simpler living in flats or in the suburbs. After the war, both these factors continued in play. In early 1919, it was reported that there were an exceptionally large number of big houses to be let in Mayfair and Knightsbridge, with rate yields to Westminster City Council down in these districts over 5% and over 9% respectively. Very large houses were empty because they were considered now unmanageable as a result of the domestic servant problem. At the same time, the demand for maisonettes and flats in London was unprecedented. They were practically unobtainable, with one estate agent registering over 150 inquiries a week, despite rents of West End flats doubling in value even from 1917 levels. These upper middle class dwellings untouched by rent control. It was from this time that the commercialisation of Mayfair and other parts of the West End for use as offices and for wholesale and retail distribution gathered pace between the wars. This is a moment of transformation in some West End districts, the commercialisation of previously residential accommodation. And we can see the effects of that still. And it was from this time, too, that the servant problem was reflected in an ingenious variety of labour-saving devices. I'm quoting from the Times, that became such a draw at the Ideal Home exhibition at Olympia as early as 1920. Electricity has been pressed into service as a regular maid of all work, the Times enthused. Among the jobs it carries out efficiently are laundry work, charring, washing up after meals, ironing, working the sewing machine, and so forth. The servant problem itself, of course, was there because domestic service, especially of the live-in variety, was not popular. The dearth of servants proper, that is of cooks, house and parlour maids and other house servants, it was said at the end of 1920, is almost as great as it was during and after the war. The taste for the freer life, developed by the countless other occupations that were then open to girls and women, is as compelling as ever. In 1920, some nursed the hope that as these jobs seemed no longer there, the women would come back to work in middle-class homes. But in fact, opportunities for young women's employment continued to grow apace in London. By 1921, the numbers of domestic servants in the County of London had fallen by a third, though it still totalled some 157,000. And there is no doubt that the reduction has continued to the present time. The new survey concluded around 1930. But despite this, a year later, the census found that the numbers of London's domestic servants had recovered to some extent in that year of slump of 1931. The fall was most marked among young women under the age of 25, for whom factory work in London was becoming ever more readily available, and the long-present hostility of the London-born girl and young woman to domestic service was maintained, young servants almost always coming from the provinces, a not insignificant factor in London's huge draw for the nation's young people in the 1920s and 30s. This revulsion against domestic service by London girls can be traced back at least to the 18th century. Here then, there was, for those who did return to work or take it up anew, to this work or take it up anew, the new survey noted with satisfaction how wages and conditions for the smaller number of London domestics had vastly improved over pre-war conditions. Here then, there was no going back. The numbers of domestic servants never again matched those of pre-war London, and the old oppressive exploitation of the general servant had become a thing of the past. There was no going back either in the opportunities for young women's work that had opened up in London during the war. Some opportunities were closed off, in road and rail transport, for instance, where women were virtually eliminated by men. But there were entirely new jobs for women in the expanding manufacturing industries of post-war London and in the ever-increasing demand for shop and office work in the capital. The feminisation of whole London spaces or districts that Christina Robert had talked about yesterday continued in the city and in the government office district around Whitehall. These opportunities for commercial and clerical work in particular had a distinctly metropolitan characteristic, unmatched by the nation as a whole. And once more, the war had a decisive impact here. For the war marked an irreversible westward shift in the economic balance of power within London, or at least it has proved irreversible up to our own times, if not beyond. Until 1914, London's industrial might had tended to look eastwards for expansion along the River Thames and around the Port of London, and to a lesser extent to the northeast along the River Lee. That was true in 1914 for London's armaments industries, London the centre of the nation's weapons trade, which were then based along the Thames at Woolwich, Erith and Crayford, and along the Lee at Enfield and Waltham Cross. But much armaments manufacture in London during the war newly planted itself in the west, exploiting underused road and rail connections rather than river traffic, and building on the new industries, especially motor and aeroplane manufacture, I've heard a bit about that had begun to settle in West London even before 1914. Entirely new industrial areas had grown during the war almost overnight in Park Royal, Perivale and Greenford, straddling the borders of Wembley, Willesden and Acton. The already emerging industrial areas at Southall, Norwood and Hayes were greatly extended, and Hendon, Colindale, Northolt and Hounslow saw the expansion of aeroplane manufacture and an extraordinary multiplication of aerodromes during the war. These districts saw the most extraordinary industrial expansion for manufacturing, a huge variety of war materiel. Engineering had been no stranger to West London before 1914. In particular, London's motor and aircraft industries had found a congenial mix of cheap land and suburban housing, attracting skilled workers to places like Acton, Chiswick, Fulham and elsewhere a few years before the war. That labour pool was now extended by the servant girls and working class housewives of West London, who generally lacked the work opportunities and traditions offered by the clothing trade and small workshop industries of the East End. There was one more factor in West London's favour. London was the railway hub of the nation, but most feeder lines, railway termini and junctions lay on the western side of the capital, connecting it to the engineering districts of the Midlands and the Northwest, and in the southwest to the main ports sending men and munitions to France: King's Cross, St Pancras, Euston, Marylebone, Paddington, Victoria, Charing Cross and Waterloo enmeshed West London in a network of steel. Within it, especially in the northwestern suburbs, munitions factories quickly took root. Most important of these developments was at the disused Royal Agricultural Society showground of Park Royal and the land adjoining it in North Acton, Harleston and Willesden. The empty showground had been part developed as a stadium for Queen's Park Rangers Football Club. It's amazing how every theme, I think, in the gets sort of migrates into this talk. But this was commandeered by the army when professional football folded in 1915. By the end of the year, a giant national filling factory was opened on a 120-acre site, making fuses, detonators and gains, which are explosive-filled triggers connecting shell nose caps to the TNT filling. By mid-1917, it was making 1.8 million shell components each week. At its peak that year, it employed 5,250 workers, 4,850 of them women. In the nearby suburban towns and villages, other munitions factories were quickly planted. A cartridge filling factory at Hayes employed 10,600, over 80% of them women. The former White City exhibition ground was turned over for munitions production. A gas shell filling plant at Greenford employed 1,000 workers. A factory making liquid oxygen for weaponry was set down in Willesden. Tank engines were built by the Astor Motor Company at Wembley, and a trench mortar bomb filling factory was established further south at Fulham. There were doubtless many more enterprises than these in this increasingly industrialised sector of West London. West London also proved especially fruitful for the expansion of London's aircraft industry, and I'll knock out a paragraph because it's been very ably covered by Nina Hadaway this morning. These wartime developments, even when decommissioned for government and military uses, were quickly resurrected for peacetime functions. So redundant but well-built Ministry of Munitions factories, all connected to good transport links and to gas and electricity supplies, were sold off to manufacturing and distribution companies from 1919, disposals that gathered pace after their former ministry's warehousing and storage functions were no longer needed from around 1922. The new industrial areas of West London were all seeded or ripened by war. Along the Edgware Road from Cricklewood to Colindale, surplus government buildings formerly making armaments and aeroplanes were converted to peacetime manufacturing and spawned new factories alongside. The same was true in Wembley and in the Perivale Greenford area, in the Vale at Acton, in Southall, Norwood, Hayes, in Heston and Isleworth, from Feltham to Staines and from Uxbridge to Slough. In all these areas, the wartime industrial concentrations were expanded greatly in the 1920s, and especially to the west. The most astonishing case was at Park Royal, bordering Acton and Willesden. The rapid development of factories in this district is truly remarkable, it was said in 1933, and it's doubtful if any other part of Greater London has been so rapidly industrialised. Prior to 1914, the whole district was practically rural and under grass. Development had another push from 1928, when the final tranche of ex-munitions land was put on the market. By 1933, in an area of 2 square miles, there were at least 130 factories, employing some 19,000 workers. Many were household names, not just in London, but nation, even worldwide. United Dairies, Lyons Bakeries, McVitie and Price, Guinness, Heinz, Stork Margarine, and many more. Some, like the giant Hoover factory on the Great West Road, were making many of those labour-saving devices for middle-class suburban homes extolled by the Ideal Home exhibition of 1920. There's a close connection between domestic comfort, electrical goods and so on in the 1920s and 30s, and this West London production. The firms who moved there were roughly evenly divided between new enterprises altogether and firms relocating from central London, like Virol, a branch of Bovril Foods, which took the opportunity to expand on a 13-acre site on former munitions plant at Park Royal at the end of 1919, and with a smattering of wartime enterprises, whose products were in even greater demand in peacetime, like the Fellows Magneto Company. With industry came labour, and with labour came housing. The western suburbs, the great growth node of outer London before 1939. In west and northwest London, 800,000 people were added to the population between 1921 and 1939. This was as though the population of Manchester had migrated lock and stock to West London in fewer than 20 years. It represented a decisive shift westwards in London's centre of gravity, many areas doubling in population in the 1920s and doubling again in the 1930s. And we remember the Harrow birthday cake. Harrow grew to a population of 190,000 between the wars, greater than that of Salford. It was small wonder that the first post-war London railway, the Ealing and Shepherd's Bush line with a station at East Acton, was built to relieve congestion in this increasingly crowded district as early as July 1920. The prospect from East Acton was said to afford the cheerful view of many new houses in the course of erection. Prospects were booming for London even when they were at their nadir in the nation as a whole. In 1931, in the middle of Britain's Great Depression, along the Great West Road and North Acton alone, 15 new factories were built during the year. For 3 months of that same year, just one of Scotland's 83 blast furnaces was firing. As the economist M.P. Fogarty wrote in 1945, London was outstandingly prosperous before the war. He meant the Second World War. London's industries and services were not merely not declining, they were advancing rapidly. Much of this turned to dust, of course, in the deindustrialization of London, which had its roots in the Second World War, and I'll come back to this point in a minute, was strengthened in the 1960s and gathered such pace that it became a vortex in the 1970s and 1980s. But one significant element of the growth of West London would provide London's greenest shoots in these very decades of industrial slump. And this too had its foundations laid during these years of the First World War. The historic connection between West London and air travel, which later had such a stunning impact on the economic fortunes of the capital, was cemented from 1914. There were some 120 aerodromes and landing grounds nationally that were surplus to the requirements of the RAF and agriculture after the war, a number of them previously utilised for the air defence of London, both east and west of the built-up area. Some of the numerous aerodromes of West London, West Middlesex, like those at Hendon, Northolt, and the London Terminal Aerodrome at Hounslow, close to what became in the 1940s London Airport at Heathrow, were relinquished by the Air Ministry for civil aviation within 6 months or so of the armistice. Civil aviation began tentatively with 15-minute flips from London's aerodromes and others on May Day 1919, but things got serious very quickly. 7 commercial civilian routes were planned at first, all between cities within the UK, apart from the Dutch route. Hounslow was the only aerodrome to operate all 7. Hounslow closed in 1920, the operation moving to Croydon. Yet by 1930, the skies of West London were so crowded and the risk of collision so great that restricted flight zones under 2,000 feet were put into operation. They affected aerodromes at Feltham, Hanworth Park, for National Flying Services Limited, Harmondsworth, Heathrow Aerodrome for the Fairey Aviation Company, Heston Air Park for Airwork Limited. It was from Heston, courtesy of British Airways, that Chamberlain made his trips to Hitler in the autumn of 1938. Northolt for the RAF and Stag Lane Aerodrome for de Havilland. All of these were in this tightly clustered area. All of these restrictions was to protect flying from the RAF's London Aerodrome at Hendon, close by. Heathrow had opened in this chrysalis form in 1929. It would take over from Croydon as London Airport after the Second World War. So the industrial hypergrowth of London during the First World War sparked changes that went well beyond the Second. Post-war London, I mean the London after 1918, did not return to pre-war economic conditions because wartime investment just kept being added to in those very same areas where it had flourished between 1914 and 1918. Because the industrial base of London continued to go from strength to strength, many other gains of the war years proved robust too. Preeminent among them, the economic gains won by working class Londoners from 1914 to 1918 were never reversed. These wartime gains were enormous. And we had a bit of controversy, I suppose, about that, because Sarah Jackson was telling us about starvation and so on in the East End in late 1914, early 1915, and the question of whether there was a hunger component to the anti-German riots of May 1915 arose yesterday morning. I personally don't think there was a connection, but certainly by the middle of 1915 and after, these were extraordinarily prosperous years for London's working people. Never before in history had London's workers done so well. And the key here was not wages. The key here was full employment, work for everyone. And everyone, including mothers with school-aged children, but in general we're talking about any young person over the age of 14, and some got permission to leave school early in the war years, could get work, and work that paid in many instances very well. These wartime gains were enormous, based largely on the bedrock of full employment for all, and secondarily on gains in real wages for the poorest unskilled workers. Real wages generally didn't keep up with rising prices in the war, but real wages for unskilled workers outstripped price rises by a significant factor. It was a revolutionary impact, widely remarked upon by commentators at the time. The poorest felt the improvement most. In 1913-14, the LCC had fed an average of 35,000 poor school children with 146,000 dinners each week. By 1918-19, it had dropped to 9,500 children receiving just 22,500 dinners each week. In 1918, it was said that the proportion of poorly nourished school children in London was considerably less than half the percentage of 1913. As with food, so with clothing. By 1918, the LCC's school clothing cupboards, from which exceptionally necessitous children used to receive garments before the war, are no longer resorted to. There are many comparable signs, too, in the sharp fall in London of those workers having to rely on the poor law to keep body and soul together. No one, we think, could have predicted that the war would have had such a remarkable effect in reducing pauperism, as it has had, noted an editorial in Charity Organisation Review in January 1916. By then, the London workhouse casual wards, providing 1 or 2 nights accommodation for vagrants and unemployed looking for work, were almost empty. And for that same class, the war saw the beginning of the demise of the privately owned common lodging house, or DOS house, in London, falling in numbers by a third between 1914 and 1918. Those numbers never recovered. Similarly, despite the stresses of war and a probable rise in London's population, the number of certified lunatics in metropolitan mental hospitals was lower by almost 16% between 1914 and 1918, largely because they now had a job to do. Even more dramatically, the number of men received into London's prisons fell by nearly 63% between 1913, 34,000, and 1918, 13,000. The Commissioners of Prisons concluded that the prisons of the country may be largely emptied of the petty offender when the conditions of labour are such as to secure full and continuous employment for all. Even many among the aged poor were somehow magicked out of the workhouse, taken back by relatives who could now give them a home, or winning once more an independent existence through work. And there are instances of people over 70 in Lambeth workhouses finding work in the Woolwich dockyards. The decline of pauperism, not a measure of the poor, but only those turning to the state for subsistence, was remarkable, falling by about a third in all forms of relief during the war, with under 47,000 indoor paupers in London workhouses in August 1918 compared to over 69,000 4 years before. The general transformation was remarked on by all with eyes to see. Michael McDonough, a Times journalist and sympathetic observer of London life, witnessed the traditional working-class holiday at Appy Hampstead Whit Monday at the end of May 1917. The great thing is that there was no sign in the crowd of the old, ugly squalor of poverty. More has been done for the social betterment of the labouring classes by 3 years of this frightful war than by the garnering of the harvests of peace for many generations. A few months later, he thought that there is now no such word as poor in our social vocabulary. Chartres Byron, the magistrate at Lambeth Police Court during the war, recalled how the war seemed to have abolished poverty. And Arthur Gleason, another middle-class celebrant of this most surprising feature of London's war, summed it all up with a biblical ring. Comfort and well-being, the margin of leisure, the elements of happiness are greater for the mass of people than at any other period. A sullenness and despair have gone from the earth. The curse is being removed. The fears of Mary Ward's waitress that peace would return her and her sister to starvation were understandable but proved gratifyingly groundless. The war largely wiped away the absolute poverty that Charles Booth uncovered in the 1880s and 90s, and which had continued to blight the lives of millions of Londoners right up to the end of 1914. The reduction of the proportion of persons in poverty in the 40 years is enormous, whichever figures we take, the new survey concluded, with one measure in East London showing that family poverty of 38% around 1890 had fallen to 6% by 1930. Although unemployment and casual labour kept levels of poverty high in parts of the inner East End at times when the main breadwinner was short of work, and figures in Stepney and Poplar were about 19 or 18% in 1930, which is still half what they'd been in Booth's day, conditions never returned to those exposed by Booth. Similarly, too, the effects on men and women out of work were mitigated after the war by improvements in unemployment insurance benefits and in the newfound readiness of London poor authorities to give relief to the poor outside the workhouse. These were both new departures, and they seemed an inevitable consequence of the shared experience of war. There would be no return to the harsh regime of incarceration and dependence on charity that had been the lot of the pauper before 1914. In charting the changes to poor relief in London, the new survey noted how Booth had accepted the view that poor relief was granted only in the workhouse, with a tiny proportion of expenditure made to the poor in their homes. That remained true, the new survey explained, until the war exploded it sky high. When industrial conditions in 1920 to 21 worsened in London, there was widespread resort to the poor law authorities for relief. It was a move urged on by Labour leaders like George Lansbury and Poplar with the cry, "Go to the workhouse." In fact, it was no longer to the workhouse that they had to look, but to out-relief, doles or benefits in kind dispersed to the poor in their own homes, given in sums never known before, and with a decency of treatment and sympathy that had always been absent in pre-war London. The relieving officer had a bad press in London during the 1930s, and no doubt deservedly so, but there was no comparison with the treatment accorded to the starving poor in the years before 1914. The transfer of poor relief from the boards of guardians to county councils in 1930, in the process becoming renamed as public assistance, was another humanising step forward in a process that had begun in the war years. There were many other effects of the war that marked a permanent shift in the life of the majority of Londoners. One followed from the continuing restrictions on access to alcohol that seemed to have impacted so much on levels of public drunkenness in London, and that reaped unquantifiable but surely momentous benefits to the quality of family life among the poorest. Londoners spent similar proportions of their income on drink before and after the war, but from 1915 they got so much less for their money. It's certain, reported the new survey, that less intoxicants of all kind are drunk per head in present-day London than in the London of Charles Booth's time, that individual drinking is less often excessive, and that the average potency of liquors is noticeably less. In general, consumption of alcohol fell by around a half between 1914 and 1929, we might judge the impact on the collective life of London's streets by the numbers of arrests for drunkenness of all kinds before 1914 and after. There were some 70,000 arrests for drunkenness in London in 1913. In 1939, there were 18,000. There were other consequences of far-reaching importance. London and the nation both were affected by the political shifts that the war hastened in the rise of the Labour Party and the increasing importance of trade unions in the economic and political life of the nation. The war brought about an early love affair between Londoners and the Labour Party that, though periodically on and off, seems not to have exhausted itself even yet. Its first flowering was spectacular, if brief. The London Labour Party was formed on the very brink of war, so that it wasn't 5 years old when it had to fight the first post-war municipal elections in 1919. Its showing in the LCC election was respectable enough for a new party facing old established blocs. Indeed, its rise effectively marked the end of the Progressive Party, the left wing of the Liberals, who had been uniquely influential in London before the war. There was then an astonishing victory, virtually from nowhere, in the Metropolitan Borough Council elections that November, when Labour won 12 out of 28 boroughs and respectable numbers of seats in many more. Most were lost in a concerted ratepayer backlash just 3 years later. But between the wars, Labour steadily established itself as political party of choice for most of those voting in local elections. That's at least in inner London or in the county council area. Labour secured the London County Council in 1934 and held it without break for the next 30 years until its abolition in 1964. By 1934 too, it controlled 15 out of 28 boroughs and 17 from 1937, some of these boroughs having no other representation but Labour. If there was one single element above any other in Labour's London stronghold, it was the housing problem. And the war played a part here too. For the great frustration for working class Londoners during the war had flowed from the contradiction between the opportunity for the first time to secure improved domestic comforts through full employment, while the capital's housing problem worsened through starvation of capital, investment for improvements, and the virtual cessation of house building, and indeed some loss of housing to industry. The Labour Party promised a municipal housing programme for London from 1919 onwards, and it was a message congenial to large numbers of working class voters in the capital, perhaps especially the many women voters among them. All this was accompanied by a growth of local health and welfare services across London that also once more built on progressive ventures projected during the war years. These too were of special interest to mothers and prospective mothers. Before the war, local maternity and child welfare services in London were woefully threadbare. The Finsbury Milk Depot, 1904, the St Pancras School for Mothers, 1907, and the North Islington Maternity Centre, 1913, had offered pretty much the only infant welfare support in the capital. The evident need to protect infant life from so many lives destroyed in the First World War drew a response from most local authorities in London, who, with the aid of government grant, began widely to employ health visitors during the war to support new babies and their mothers at home. Many also established infant welfare centres for ante and postnatal advice and practical assistance. By May 1919, there were 93 health visitors employed by Metropolitan Borough Councils, though unevenly distributed. Many other councils in both London County and the Outer Ring provided infant welfare centres for medical advice and treatment, with dozens established from Acton to Woolwich by the end of the war. Centres run by voluntary action and funded by subscribers paying for premises and medical staff were also set up in many places, particularly the middle-class districts around Westminster and Marylebone. These trends continued apace after the armistice. By 1930, Metropolitan Borough Councils employed 200 health visitors and were spending £250,000 each year on maternity and child welfare services. Many changes then of the war years proved enduring, but not all things brought about by the First World War in London did so. In this context, we might mention here two further specific consequences of the war for London that had an important impact for a generation or so to come, but which did prove transitory. One was the decline in its foreign-born population, in the foreign-born population of London, reversing a trend towards the making of a cosmopolitan metropolis that had begun to establish itself powerfully from the 1880s. The fall of some 16% in persons born abroad in London by 1921 compared to 1911, some 28,500 fewer people, was largely made up of the drastic reduction in the numbers of Germans and Austrians living in London, perpetuated by anti-alien immigration restrictions that tightened after the war. But even the French and the Italians, allies both, did not quite return in the numbers they had reached before 1914. London, very much against the grain of the previous 30 years, had suddenly become more insular and remained so for another generation until a new cosmopolitan revolution began rapidly to assert itself from the late 1940s on. And I say this despite the migration of Jewish Germans and others in the 1930s. Another consequence arose from the bitter experience of the air war against London. As war once more began to look at probability from the late 1930s, with attention shifting to rearmament and the defence of the realm, two conflicting preoccupations with London emerged. On the one hand, there was a determination not to repeat the confusion and incompetence that compromised the safety of the Londoner during the Great War, so the planning of air raid precautions in respect of warnings, shelters, welfare provision and evacuation. Also woefully lacking for the First War was put in place for a second, though implementation on the ground would prove less successful than the planning itself. But on the other hand, there grew a conviction that no amount of planning could in reality protect this enormous city and its people from the bomber. I think it is well also for the man in the street to realise that there is no power on earth that can protect him from being bombed. Stanley Baldwin famously told the House of Commons in November 1932, whatever people may tell him, the bomber will always get through. When he said this, Baldwin must have had in mind the experiences of London and Paris during the Great War, but within a few years his argument gained plausibility from the horrors of bombing in Abyssinia and Spain. The vulnerability of London to aerial bombardment was one element in the emerging consensus among planners and politicians in the 1930s that London was far too big and needed to lose both industry and people to protect not just itself but the nation as a whole. The extraordinary resilience of London's diverse economy during the years of the Great Depression was thought by many to have been at the expense of the nation, especially the distressed areas of the north of England, of Wales and Scotland. The clamour for government to do something, not just to stop London growing on the ground, but to relocate its people and their jobs to other areas, grew deafening. The fears of bombing in the late 1930s added urgency to the need, not just because there were so many civilians in London, but because so many of the defence industries continued to be clustered there as they had been between 1914 and 1918. Decentralisation policies of the 1930s and 40s had their roots in these arguments, and they in turn were fuelled by London's wartime experiences between 1914 and 1918. As the Barlow Commission on the Distribution of Britain's Industrial Population concluded in August 1939, the persistent pull of the metropolis and the growth in the density of its population are enlarging the metropolitan target and rendering it more and more vulnerable to aerial attack. In the view of many who have given evidence before the Commission, a view with which we find ourselves in complete accord, the circumstances are such as to demand that steps be taken without delay with the object of checking its further growth. By August 1939, it was all too late, but it's possible to see in the Barlow Commission and the weight of opinion that pressed on it by the end of the 1930s the roots of the decentralisation policies of the 1940s, 1950s and 1960s, in the new towns, in the location of offices bureau, and in the planning policies of the LCC and even the early years of the Greater London Council that continued to shed jobs and people from London, London reaching its lowest point of population in the century, or certainly after about 1905, I should think, in around 1983, with about 6.3 million people at that point, compared to 8.6 million in 1939. In all these ways, and no doubt others I've neglected, a big one I think is class relations, and I'm not quite sure what to say about the impact of the war on class. And I should have mentioned overcrowding on London transport, which Simon mentioned yesterday, and I've no doubt there are others. The impact of the First World War on London reverberated for generations to come. Would these changes have happened without the war, I hear you asking? Quite possibly, I think, in most cases, but not all. And surely they would not have happened so quickly, and surely, too, they wouldn't necessarily have happened in exactly the same spaces. The war proved a revolutionary accelerator of tendencies already apparent in many cases before 1914. It did indeed change London and the Londoner for much of the rest of the 20th century, and even when we think about West London and Heathrow today beyond. In so many ways, as we have seen, these were changes that benefited London, that were positive for its future development and for its place in the nation and the world. And maybe I can close as we approach the 70th anniversary of VE Day by speculating on the contrasting nature of the impact of two world wars on London in the 20th century. I've long thought it a terrible irony that the experience of the Great War, with its huge destruction of human life on the Western Front for causes and reasons that later generations grew to despise, was of such positive consequences for London. Whereas the experience of the Second World War, despite its being waged in a cause that none could argue with, and despite the resonance in the popular culture of London can take it that has since grown to mythic status, should, in the long run, have proved so destructive for the capital. For it's in the years between 1940 and 1945, I think, that we can see so many of the seeds of what would for London generally be 3, perhaps 4 decades of subsequent decline involving deindustrialization, the closure of the upper port, and the drastic loss of jobs and people that reached its nadir in the early 1980s. These were 2 very contrasting legacies, perhaps the subject of a further conference like this in a few years' time.